You ever hear stories about homeowners associations going way too far? Yeah, we've all seen those posts online. Neighbors complaining about the wrong shade of mailbox paint or grass that's a quarter-inch too tall. But what happened to my grandpa while I was away wasn't just about grass or fences or mailboxes. No, this was an all-out war, and they picked the wrong family to mess with. See, my grandfather, an old Army vet with more backbone than most men half his age, lives in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Well, quiet on the outside. Behind the neatly trimmed hedges and those matching beige houses sits one of the most power-hungry, meddling HOAs you could ever imagine. I was out of state for work at the time, away for about 2 months. Grandpa insisted he didn't need me around, said he could handle himself. But you see, the HOA didn't see an elderly man who served his country. They saw someone they thought they could bully. Someone they thought they could push around until he either bent to their will or left. It all started with a letter. Grandpa called me one evening, his voice steady but with an edge to it. It's a kind of tone he used when he didn't want me to worry but couldn't quite hide the anger. He said, "Son, they're threatening me with fines." Something about the flag in my yard. Now, if there's one thing you should know about Grandpa, it's that his flag, that American flag, isn't just decoration. It's his life. It's the memory of his fallen brothers. It's the reminder of nights he spent in the desert, of mornings in the mud, of sacrifice and pride. Taking down that flag. Not an option. Not ever, but the HOA claimed it was too large. They said it violated community aesthetics. Imagine that? A piece of cloth representing freedom, somehow offending the neighborhood board. Grandpa told them as much. Politely at first. But when he refused, that's when they escalated. They started sending fines. $100, then $200. Soon they stacked up to thousands. Grandpa ignored them. He wasn't about to pay for something that wasn't wrong. Then they started with the warnings failure to comply may result in legal action. Legal action. Against an 8-year-old veteran for flying the flag he nearly died defending. And then came the worst part. When I got back 2 months later, I found out they'd actually tried to evict him. Evict? Can you believe that? They went to court, claimed unpaid fines, claimed community disruption. But what they didn't realize was this: the very police officers they tried to call to enforce their little crusade. Yeah, they work for me. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back. While I was away, Grandpa handled things the only way he knew how, with quiet defiance. Every morning, same as always, he raised that flag. Rain or shine. He'd salute it, lips moving in a prayer I know by heart, and go about his day. The neighbors, most of them, at least, respected him. Some even supported him. But the HOA board, oh no, they weren't having it. They sent inspectors to his property. You know, those self-appointed clipboard warriors who think they're some kind of law enforcement. They took photos. They wrote reports. And when that didn't shake him, they started knocking on his door at odd hours, trying to intimidate him. Grandpa didn't scare easy. He'd stand there in his old camo jacket, stare them down until they shuffled away. But one evening, things escalated. A black SUV pulled into his driveway, uninvited. Out stepped the HOA president herself, a sharp-faced woman named Barbara, who carried herself like a queen surveying her peasants. She told Grandpa in no uncertain terms that if he didn't take down the flag, they'd take him to court, seize his property, and kick him out. And you know what Grandpa did? He laughed. He laughed right in her face. That's when she snapped. Barbara leaned in, voice dripping with venom, and said, "We'll see who wins this, old man. We make the rules here." And with that, she stormed off. Grandpa didn't tell me all of this right away. He didn't want to burden me. But he kept a journal. Every letter, every visit, every threat, he wrote it down. And when I finally saw it, when I finally sat down in his kitchen, flipping through those pages, my blood boiled. Because this wasn't just harassment. This wasn't just some overzealous HOA flexing their rules. No, this was personal. And when I got involved, it turned into a battle they never saw coming. Asterisk, asterisk, when I came home and found out what the HOA had been doing while I was gone, I felt two things at once, anger and shame. Anger because no one should ever treat my grandfather that way. Shame because I wasn't there to stop it from happening sooner. Grandpa brushed it off when I asked why he hadn't called me earlier. He said, "Son, you've got your own life to worry about. I can handle a bunch of pencil pushers." That's who he was. Tough, proud, never wanting to be a burden. But when I saw the stack of letters piled high on the kitchen table, each stamped with bold red warnings, I realized it wasn't just harassment anymore. They were gunning for him. The fines were ridiculous. $200 for unapproved flag dimensions, $500 for obstruction of sightline. One notice even claimed that his flagpole was creating a safety hazard, a hazard. The pole was cemented 3 feet into the ground. It was sturdier than the HOA's office, I'll tell you that much. But the final letter in the stack, that's what broke me. It wasn't a fine. It was a notice of foreclosure proceedings. That's right. They weren't just threatening anymore. They were moving to take his house. Now let me explain something. Most people don't realize HOAs actually have the power to foreclose on your home if you rack up unpaid fines. It's insane, but it's true. And that's exactly what they tried to do to my grandfather. But here's the kicker. Grandpa never signed away his rights. He never agreed to half the rules they were trying to enforce. His property was grandfathered in long before the current HOA even existed. They didn't care, though. They thought he was too old, too stubborn, too poor to fight back. They thought wrong. The day I got home, I walked the property with Grandpa. He stood there in his worn boots, his back straight as ever, staring at that flag like it was the only thing holding him up. And maybe it was. I asked him straight out, "Do you want to fight this?" He looked at me, eyes steady, and said, "Son, I fought bigger battles than this one. But they're not just coming for me. They're coming for everything I believe in." So yeah, we fight. That was all I needed to hear. The next morning, I started digging. I went through every letter, every notice, every so-called violation. Grandpa kept immaculate notes, dates, names, even the exact times they came to harass him. He had receipts stacked higher than their bogus fines. And then I noticed something. The HOA wasn't just targeting Grandpa. There were mentions of other violators in the community. Little things, like a neighbor fined for planting roses instead of approved landscaping. Another threatened for parking his truck in his own driveway overnight. It wasn't just my grandfather, it was everyone. They were running this neighborhood like their personal kingdom. That's when I realized something critical. This wasn't just about Grandpa's flag. This was about power, and nothing makes power-hungry people angrier than someone who refuses to bow down. A week later, the HOA held one of their infamous board meetings. These were mandatory for homeowners, but most folks dreaded them. They'd sit quietly, nodding along, while Barbara, the president, strutted around like she was queen of suburbia. But that night, Grandpa and I showed up. We walked into that stuffy community hall. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and every head turned. Barbara's face soured immediately. She knew we weren't there to sit quietly. The meeting dragged on with the usual nonsense. Lawn lengths, paint colors, trash can placement. Then Barbara cleared her throat and said, "Next on the agenda, the ongoing issue with Mr. Thompson's property. That's my grandfather." You could feel the tension in the room. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably, Others avoided eye contact. A few looked sympathetic, but nobody dared speak up. Barbara launched into a speech about community standards and compliance, tossing around words like mandatory removal and financial penalties. And that's when Grandpa stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just said, "That flag stays. You'll have to bury me before you take it down." Dead silence. Barbara turned red. She sputtered something about rules and bylaws, waving a binder like it was a holy book. That's when I spoke up. I said, "Funny thing about those bylaws? Half of them don't apply to his property. And the other half, they've been misfiled." I checked. Barbara's eyes widened. She hadn't expected pushback. Not like this. She tried to shut me down, claiming the board has full authority, but the cracks were showing. A few neighbors started whispering. One even muttered, "He's right, you know." And then, the twist? Barbara smirked and said, "Well, perhaps the police can explain it better when they arrive." And right on cue. 2 patrol cars pulled up outside. The board members sat a little straighter, smug looks plastered across their faces. They thought this was the checkmate moment. The HOA calls the cops. The old man folds. The problem disappears, except they didn't know one crucial detail. The officers who stepped inside. They weren't just cops. They were my guys. I worked with them every day. And when they saw me standing there, arms crossed beside my grandfather, the entire game changed. Barbara's smile faltered as the officers walked over, not to Grandpa. Not to me, but straight to her. "Ma'am," one of them said calmly, "we've received reports of harassment and possible elder abuse. Care to explain?" You could have heard a pin drop. Barbara stammered, tried to regain control, but it was too late. The tide had turned. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about saving Grandpa's home anymore. This was about tearing down the entire rotten empire the HOA had built, and we were just getting started. Asterisk. Barbara didn't know what to say. For the first time in probably years, she didn't have a script, a smug comeback, or the upper hand. The officers weren't backing her little power play. They were looking at her like she was the problem, and the truth was, she was. Grandpa just stood there, calm as ever, letting her squirm. He didn't need to say a word. He had already made his stand. The rest was on me now. I stepped forward and handed the officer a folder. Inside were copies of every letter, every fine, every ridiculous violation they'd slapped on my grandfather. I'd spent the last 2 nights organizing them, cross-referencing their bylaws, even highlighting contradictions. The officer flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each turn. "Looks like you've got quite a paper trail here," he muttered. Barbara jumped in, her voice shrill. "Those are legitimate fines. He's in violation of our community standards, and as president, I have the authority." The officer cut her off. "Ma'am, harassment of an elderly resident is not authority. It's a crime." The room went dead silent. You could feel the shift. The smug confidence drained from the board members' faces. The neighbors, who had been too scared to speak up before, started whispering louder. Some even nodded, like they were seeing the truth for the first time. Barbara tried to recover. She snapped at the officers, insisting they remove Grandpa from the property for non-compliance. But the officer simply said, "With all due respect, we don't work for you. We work for the law." And that was it. Checkmate, or so I thought. See, people like Barbara don't give up easily. They don't take humiliation well. She might have lost that battle, but the war was far from over. And when pride and power are on the line, desperate people do desperate things. After the meeting broke up, neighbors started approaching us. Quietly at first. A man from across the street pulled me aside and said, "They fined me $600 for putting a swing set in my backyard." said it was an eyesore. Another whispered I had to repaint my whole house because they didn't like the shade of beige I chose. Story after story poured out. I realized this wasn't just harassment, it was extortion. The HOA wasn't protecting property values. They were lining their pockets, and Barbara was at the center of it all that night. Grandpa and I sat at the kitchen table. Papers spread everywhere. He lit his old pipe, the smoke curling above us as he studied the mess. "Son," he said, "this isn't about me anymore. This is about the whole neighborhood." He was right. The HOA had built a little empire of fear, and my grandfather had just become the rallying point. But if Barbara thought she could scare us off, she was dead wrong. Because here's what she didn't know. I wasn't just some guy helping out his grandpa. I had friends. Friends with badges. Friends who didn't take kindly to bullies hiding behind fake authority. And we were about to shine a very bright light on everything they'd been doing. 2 days later, I got a call. It was one of the officers who'd been at the meeting. He told me something that made my stomach turn. Apparently, Barbara had tried to file a complaint against my grandfather. Not just a civil one, a criminal one. She claimed he threatened her during their confrontation at his house. Of course, it was a lie. Grandpa never threatened anyone. But lies can stick if they're written down on the right paper. If Barbara could get a criminal record pinned on him, she'd have all the leverage she needed to finish what she started. That was her play. Destroy his reputation, then seize his home. I hung up the phone and told Grandpa. He didn't even flinch. He just took a long drag of his pipe and said, "Let her try." But I wasn't about to just sit back. The next step was clear. We needed proof. Not just of their harassment, but of their corruption. The money trails. The backroom deals. The rules they made up on the fly to squeeze people dry. So, I did what I do best. I investigated. I started with the HOA's financial statements. By law, they were required to make them available to residents. Barbara tried to stall, of course, claiming the records were confidential, but I knew the law. And when I showed up with 2 officers to help her remember, suddenly those records weren't so confidential anymore. And what I found? It was worse than I imagined. Tens of thousands of dollars in maintenance fees with no receipts. Payments to contractors that didn't exist. Even personal expenses buried in the accounts, dinners, vacations, shopping sprees. Barbara had turned the HOA into her personal ATM. But the crown jewel. A line item labeled Legal Actions Fund. Nearly $50,000 set aside just for suing residents. $50,000, not for repairs, not for community projects, but to bankroll their bullying. That's when it clicked. This wasn't incompetence. It was a business model. They thrived on fear, on pushing people just far enough that they'd either pay up or move out. And my grandfather was supposed to be just another casualty. Not this time. The more I dug, the more neighbors came forward. A single mother fined for leaving her trash cans out a few hours too long. An elderly couple forced to tear down their garden because it didn't fit community aesthetics. Family who lost their home entirely after Barbara drained them with lawsuit after lawsuit. Each story lit a fire in me. This wasn't just a fight for Grandpa's flag. It was a fight for every family in that neighborhood. But Barbara wasn't going down quietly. The night after I pulled the financials, Grandpa woke me up at 2 a.m. There was a sound outside. Footsteps. Shadows moving near the flagpole. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed out. And there they were, 2 men in dark hoodies, tools in hand, trying to cut the flag down. They froze when the beam hit them. One bolted immediately. The other wasn't so fast. I caught a glimpse of his face before he scrambled over the fence. And you know what? I recognized him. He wasn't some random vandal. He was one of the HOA board members. That was it. Barbara had gone from harassment, to sabotage, and I promise you, that was the last line she would ever cross. Because if she wanted a war, oh, she just got one. Asterisk, asterisk, when I saw that board member sprinting off into the dark after trying to cut down my grandfather's flag. Something inside me snapped. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This wasn't about fines or bylaws. This was trespassing. Vandalism, maybe even worse. And the worst part. Barbara had clearly sent them. Grandpa stood beside me on the porch, shotgun cradled in his arms. He hadn't fired it, not yet, but the look in his eyes told me he was ready to defend that flag with everything he had left. "Son," he said, his voice low and steady. "They're scared." That's why they came in the night. He was right. They'd seen the neighborhood waking up, seen their power slipping. So they tried to take the one thing they couldn't win against, his pride, but they failed. The next morning, I called a meeting. Not an HOA meeting. A real meeting with the neighbors. We gathered in Grandpa's yard, under that flag, the sun rising behind it like a promise. At first, only a handful showed up. But word spread fast. By noon, we had nearly 20 families standing there. I laid it all out for them. The fines, the corruption, the fake contractors, the harassment. I showed them the files I'd pulled from the HOA's own records. The room buzzed with shock and anger. People who'd stayed quiet for years finally realized they weren't alone. One man raised his hand. "What can we do?" "They'll just fine us harder if we push back." I shook my head. "Not if we push together. One family can be crushed. 20 families. That's a movement." Grandpa stepped forward then, his voice carrying like a drill sergeant. "These people think they own us. They don't. We built these homes. We paid for this land. They work for us, not the other way around." The crowd erupted in applause, and right then I knew the neighborhood had shifted. The fear was cracking, but Barbara must have felt it too. Because that afternoon, she came storming into the yard. Heels clicking on the pavement, clipboard in hand like a weapon. Her face twisted when she saw the crowd. "What is this?" "This is unauthorized assembly on HOA property." Grandpa didn't even flinch. "My yard, my flag, my property. You don't own it, Barbara." She tried to bark over him, waving her binder. "These people are in violation just for being here without board approval. Every one of you will be fined." That's when one of the neighbors shouted back, "Go ahead and fine us. We're done paying." Another joined in, "Yeah, you'll never see another dime from me." Barbara's face turned scarlet. She wasn't used to resistance. She tried to scream louder, but the crowd drowned her out. Finally, she spun on her heel and hissed at me. "You think you're clever. You think you've won. I'll bury you in court." And then she stormed off. The neighbors looked shaken, but I told them not to worry. Because here's the thing about bullies. When you shine a light on them, they panic. And Barbara was panicking. Still, I knew she wasn't bluffing about court. If she had 50 grand tucked away just for lawsuits, she was going to use it. So I decided to flip the script. And then she stormed off. The neighbors looked shaken, but I told them not to worry. Because here's the thing about bullies. When you shine a light on them, they panic. And Barbara was panicking. Still, I knew she wasn't bluffing about court. If she had 50 grand tucked away just for lawsuits, she was going to use it. So I decided to flip the script. Instead of waiting for her to drag us into her game, I filed first with the help of a lawyer friend, another vet who owed Grandpa his life from years ago. We filed a civil suit for harassment, elder abuse, and financial mismanagement. We attached the financial records I'd uncovered, along with sworn statements from the neighbors. We weren't just defending ourselves anymore. We were going on the attack. But Barbara wasn't done scheming. A few nights later, I came home from work and found Grandpa sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in his hands. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white. I asked him what it was. He slid it across the table. It was an anonymous note. Block letters cut from magazines like some bad ransom movie. Back off, or the flag burns next time. That was it. No signature. No proof. Just a threat. I felt the rage boil up. But Grandpa, he chuckled. Actually, chuckled. Cowards, he said. If they had any backbone, they'd show their faces. I wanted to storm down to Barbara's house right then and there. But Grandpa put a hand on my shoulder. Son wars aren't won by losing your temper. Let them come. We'll be ready. And ready we were. The next weekend, we installed cameras. High-resolution, motion-detecting night vision cameras all around the property. I called in a few favors from friends on the force. Not official business, but personal. They made sure everything was set up tight. If anyone so much as stepped onto Grandpa's lawn, we'd catch them in 4K. And sure enough, it didn't take long. 2 nights later, movement alerts pinged my phone. I pulled up the feed, and there it was. A figure creeping along the fence line. Not a board member this time. A hired hand. Some punk with a hoodie and a can of gasoline. But what he didn't know was that he was being watched. I called it in immediately. By the time he struck a match, red and blue lights flooded the street. He dropped everything and tried to run, but the cops tackled him before he made it 10 feet. And when they questioned him, he folded fast. Said he'd been paid to scare us. Paid by who? He wouldn't name names. But we didn't need him to. Everyone knew. Barbara had crossed into criminal territory now. The next morning, I delivered the footage straight to my lawyer. Within hours, it was filed as evidence in our case. Not just harassment anymore. Now it was conspiracy to commit arson. The neighbors rallied even harder. Word spread like wildfire. People who had never dared to question the HOA were suddenly showing up at Grandpa's door, offering statements, sharing their own horror stories. Barbara's empire was crumbling from the inside, but she still had one card left to play. The lawsuit hearings were scheduled for the following month. Barbara showed up with a team of slick lawyers in tailored suits ready to drown us in paperwork and legal jargon. But what she didn't realize was that we weren't coming in empty-handed. We had the financial records. We had the witness statements. We had the footage of her board members sabotaging the flag and the hired arsonist trying to burn it down. And most importantly, we had the truth. When the judge looked over our case and then back at Barbara, I saw something I'd never seen before on her face. Fear, because she finally realized this wasn't just about fines, or flags, or power. This was about justice, and justice was coming for her. The day of the hearing felt like a storm had rolled into town. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the air had that electric charge that makes your skin prickle. Grandpa put on his old suit, the same one he wore to every important occasion. His medals weren't pinned to his chest, but they didn't need to be. You could see his honor in the way he stood tall, even with age slowing him down. As for me, I wasn't nervous. I was angry. Angry at the months of harassment. Angry at the threats. Angry at the way Barbara strutted into that courtroom like she still had control. She arrived flanked by 3 lawyers. All sharp suits and sharper smiles. They carried briefcases stuffed with papers, hoping to bury us under the weight of legal jargon. Barbara walked in behind them, chin high, like she was walking a red carpet instead of into judgment. But then we walked in. Just me, Grandpa, and our lawyer, an old war buddy of his named Sam. Sam wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. He'd faced worse than any courtroom. The judge entered. The bailiff called the room to order, and just like that, the battle began. Barbara's lawyers went first. They painted Grandpa as a habitual violator, a man who refused to comply with community standards. They waved around photos of his flag, his yard, even his driveway, like they were evidence of a crime. Every word was laced with venom. Every sentence designed to make Grandpa look like the problem. But when they sat down, Sam stood up. He didn't start with the flag. He didn't start with the fines. He started with Grandpa's service record. This man, he said, pointing to my grandfather, risked his life for the freedoms this flag represents. And now, at 80 years old, he is being harassed, threatened, and nearly burned out of his home by the very people who are supposed to protect this community. The room went still. Even the judge leaned forward. Then Sam dropped the first bombshell, the financial records. He walked the judge through line after line of bogus expenses, unaccounted funds, and payments to contractors that didn't exist. He showed how the HOA had set aside nearly $50,000 for lawsuits, weaponizing their authority against the very people they served. Barbara shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Then came the second bombshell, the footage. We played the video of the arson attempt. On a screen in front of the court, gasoline, matches, a man running when the sirens appeared. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Do you know this man?" Sam asked Barbara. She stammered, denied, said she had no idea who he was. But the neighbors who came to testify told a different story. One after another, they took the stand, sharing how the HOA had bullied, fined, and threatened them too. Their voices cracked with frustration and relief, because finally, someone was listening. And then came the final piece. I stood up and told my side. How I'd come back from out of state to find my grandfather under siege. How I'd caught board members trespassing. How I'd collected every piece of paper, every letter, every threat. How Barbara had laughed in my grandfather's face when he refused to take down his flag. When I finished, the judge sat back in his chair, silent for a long moment. Then he looked at Barbara. "Double quotes, Mrs. Green," he said, his voice steady. "This court does not exist to enforce personal vendettas. What I see here is a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and mismanagement that is not only unethical, but unlawful." Barbara's face went pale. Her lawyers scrambled, whispering frantically, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The judge ordered an immediate injunction against the HOA. No more fines. No more threats. No more foreclosure proceedings. He also ordered a full audit of their finances by an independent investigator. And just like that, Barbara's empire began to crumble. But it didn't end there. See, when you pull at one loose thread, sometimes the whole sweater unravels. The audit uncovered not just mismanagement, but outright embezzlement. Tens of thousands of dollars pocketed by Barbara and her closest allies. Trips, dinners, even a luxury SUV, all paid for with HOA money. The fallout was immediate. Barbara was forced to resign as president. Several board members stepped down with her. And then came the criminal charges: fraud, conspiracy, attempted arson by proxy. The neighborhood that once feared her now watched as she was led away in handcuffs. But even with all that, Grandpa never gloated. He never rubbed it in. He just kept raising that flag every morning, same as he always had. One evening, after it was all over, I asked him how he stayed so calm through it all. He smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Son," he said, "I fought for this country so people could live free. If I can't even raise the flag in my own yard, then what was the point? Some battles you fight with guns. Some battles you fight with words. But you always fight." And that's when I realized this wasn't just a story about an HOA gone rogue. This was a story about standing your ground, about refusing to be bullied, about protecting what matters most. The neighborhood was never the same after that. The new board, made up of honest neighbors, vowed transparency. Fines dropped. Rules eased. People actually started enjoying where they lived again, and every time someone walked past Grandpa's house, they looked up at that flag not just as a piece of cloth, but as a reminder that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can spark the biggest change. And as for Barbara, well, last I heard, she was fighting her own battles in court. Only this time, she wasn't the one calling the shots. She was the one answering for them. After the judge handed down his decision, it felt like a dam had burst in the neighborhood. For years, people had whispered their frustrations, swallowed their anger, and paid their fines in silence. Now they walked with their heads high, smiling at one another in a way I'd never seen before. The next morning, when Grandpa raised his flag, it wasn't just him anymore. One by one, neighbors started putting up their own. Small flags in flower beds, flags on porches. Some bought big poles like his. Within a week, the street looked like a parade route. It was a quiet rebellion, a way of saying, "You don't own us anymore." Grandpa didn't say much about it, but I noticed the way his hand lingered on the rope when he raised his flag now, his eyes misting just a little. That flag wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to all of them. But while the neighborhood celebrated, I couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't over. Barbara had been forced out, sure. The board had crumbled. Criminal charges loomed. But I knew people like her. They don't just disappear. They wait. They plot. They come back swinging when you least expect it. And I was right. A week after the hearing, I was leaving Grandpa's house when I noticed a car parked across the street. Dark windows. Engine idling. It had been there for hours. I walked over, but the car pulled away before I could get close. No plates on the front. Tinted so dark, I couldn't see who was inside. When I told Grandpa, he just shrugged. They're watching. Let 'em watch. A man who lives right has nothing to hide. But I wasn't so sure. The audit into the HOA finances had opened a can of worms. Turns out Barbara hadn't acted alone. There were bigger fish tied up in her scheme, shady contractors, lawyers who'd bent the rules. Even a local politician who'd quietly benefited from HOA kickbacks. And now that Barbara was in the spotlight, those bigger fish had a problem. Because if she went down, they might go down with her, which meant they had a reason to make us shut up. I started seeing signs. Mail missing from Grandpa's box. Strange calls in the middle of the night with no one on the other end. Once, I came out in the morning and found the tires on my truck slashed. These weren't coincidences. The neighbors were on edge too. One family told me they got a letter slipped under their door. No return address, warning them not to testify further in any investigation. Another said they spotted unfamiliar men walking the neighborhood late at night, pretending to jog but never breaking a sweat. It felt like we'd kicked over a hornet's nest. But Grandpa, he never flinched. One evening, I sat with him on the porch, the crickets chirping, the flag rippling above us in the breeze. I asked him if he was worried. He just leaned back in his chair, pipe smoke curling around him, and said, "Son, I've been shot at, shelled, and stranded in deserts halfway across the world. If they think a couple of cowards in suits are gonna scare me, they picked the wrong man." That was Grandpa, but me, I couldn't let it go. So I kept digging. I pulled county records, contractor logs, property transfers. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. Barbara's HOA wasn't just corrupt, it was a front. Money had been funneled through phony contracts, then washed clean through community projects that never existed. The money trail stretched out of the neighborhood and into some very unfriendly territory. It wasn't about lawns and fences anymore. It was about organized theft. And suddenly, our little neighborhood war looked like part of something much bigger. I shared what I found with Sam, our lawyer. His face darkened as he read through the documents. "This isn't HOA stuff anymore," he said quietly. "This is racketeering. Maybe even organized crime." That explained the car across the street. The phone calls. The slashed tires. We weren't just fighting Barbara anymore. We were stepping on the toes of people who played for keeps. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Grandpa, about the neighbors who had trusted me, about the fact that by pushing this far, we might have put targets on all our backs. But then morning came, and I watched Grandpa walk outside in his boots, stand tall, and raise that flag like nothing in the world could stop him. And I knew we couldn't back down, because if we did, then Barbara and everyone behind her would win. So I made a choice. I called in every favor I had. Old friends from the force. Guys who'd moved up the chain into state investigations. People who didn't scare easy. I laid everything out: the fraud, the threats, the arson attempt, the missing money, and slowly the net started to tighten. Unmarked cars began rolling through the neighborhood. But this time, they weren't there to scare us. They were there to watch them. One night, I saw Barbara's old treasurer, a man who'd vanished right after the audit, get pulled over and quietly escorted into the back of a black SUV. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just gone. The neighbors started to notice too. The strange men in suits weren't around anymore. The anonymous notes stopped. The calls went quiet. It was like a storm had passed. But I knew better. It wasn't over. It was just shifting. A few weeks later, word came down. Barbara had flipped, facing years behind bars. She'd started talking, naming names. And the names she gave. They reached higher than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. But while the city and state untangled that mess, life in the neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA board, real neighbors this time. Not power-hungry tyrants, met in Grandpa's yard for their first gathering. No fancy halls. No binders full of nonsense. Just folding chairs, lemonade, a queue, and people actually listening to each other. They voted to cut the ridiculous fines, rewrite the rules to make sense, and open every financial record to the community. Transparency, accountability, respect, for the first time in years. People weren't afraid of their HOA, and through it all, Grandpa kept raising his flag. One day, a little boy from down the street rode his bike up to the yard. He looked up at the pole and asked, "Mister, why do you fly it every day?" Grandpa knelt down, his old knees creaking, and said, "Because it reminds me that we're free. And sometimes, son, you've got to fight a little to keep it that way." The boy nodded like he understood. And maybe he did. But even in that moment of peace, I knew we weren't quite at the end. Because somewhere out there, the people Barbara had exposed were still watching. And they weren't the kind to forgive or forget. So while the neighborhood finally found its peace, I stayed alert. Watching the street, checking the cameras, making sure that if the storm came back, we'd be ready. Because this story wasn't just about winning one fight, it was about staying ready for the next. Asterisk. Peace in the neighborhood lasted about a month. Long enough for the grass to grow greener, long enough for neighbors to relax, long enough for Grandpa to start whittling wood again on the porch. But peace has a way of drawing out the predators. It started with a letter. No return address, no name. Just one line typed on plain paper. Stay out of what doesn't concern you, or the old man pays. I found it tucked under the mat one morning, and my stomach turned cold. Grandpa read it, snorted, and tossed it straight into the trash. "Son, I've been threatened by men a lot scarier than whoever wrote that," he said. But I couldn't shrug it off, because this wasn't the HOA anymore. This was bigger. Barbara's testimony had cracked open a whole network of fraud fake contractors. Shell companies, kickbacks to city officials. The state investigators were neck-deep in it. And my name had popped up more than once in their files as the one who lit the fuse. And the people on the other end of that fuse weren't the type to forgive. The next sign came. 2 nights later. I was locking up Grandpa's shed when I heard it. The crunch of gravel, slow and deliberate. I turned, and there he was, a man in a black leather jacket standing at the edge of the yard. He didn't say a word. Just stared at me. When I took a step forward, he lifted his hand, and in it was a lighter. He flicked it once, the flame glowing in the dark, then snapped it shut and walked off into the night. A message, plain as day. I didn't tell Grandpa about that one. He'd only get mad if he thought I was hiding something. But I also didn't want him sleeping with one eye open. Instead, I doubled down. I upgraded the cameras, added motion sensors, even got a buddy from the department to loan me some extra gear. Grandpa grumbled about living in Fort Knox, but I didn't care, because I knew they were coming, and they didn't wait long. 3 nights later, a dog started barking. I grabbed the shotgun and ran out onto the porch. 2 figures were in the yard, crouched low, trying to pour something along the base of the flagpole. Gasoline. I racked the shotgun, and the sound echoed like thunder. Step away from that pole. I shouted. They froze, then bolted. One darted left, the other right. I chased, but they were fast, disappearing into the tree line before I could get close. All they left behind was a half-empty gas can. Grandpa came out in his slippers, calm as ever. He looked at the can, then at me. "I told you," he said. "They don't scare me." But I wasn't worried about him being scared. I was worried about them not stopping. The next morning, I went to see Sam, our lawyer. I laid out everything, the threats, the shadows, the gas can. He listened, rubbing his jaw. "This is retaliation," he said, finally. "The deeper this case goes, the more desperate they'll get. You and your grandfather are symbols, now proof they can be beaten. And they don't want that symbol standing." I knew he was right. So I made another call. This time, to an old contact in the organized crime task force. I told him everything, and he didn't even sound surprised. "We've had eyes on this ring for years," he said. "Didn't expect it to tie into a suburban HOA, but corruption runs where money flows. You've stumbled into something real. Stay sharp." Stay sharp. Easy to say when it wasn't your grandfather they were threatening. The task force started showing more presence in the area. Low-profile surveillance. Marked units cruising by at odd hours. But the threats didn't stop. One afternoon, a rock came sailing through Grandpa's front window. When I pulled it out of the glass, I saw a note wrapped around it. "Next time, it won't be a rock." Grandpa swept up the glass, muttering under his breath. But later that night, I caught him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at his medals. Not angry. Not scared. Just tired. And that's when it hit me. They weren't just trying to scare us. They were trying to wear us down, make us crack, make us leave, make us run. But they didn't understand something. Grandpa didn't run from enemies in the desert. And I wasn't about to run from suits and shadows, so we turned the tables. I started coordinating with the task force directly. Cameras weren't just for us anymore. They were feeding into live surveillance. Every car that passed too many times got tagged. Every face that lingered too long got logged. We set a trap. I told the neighbors to keep their flags up, keep their routines normal. But behind the scenes, the task force had unmarked units stationed at every corner of the block. It didn't take long. 2 men showed up again late one night, this time with cans of paint. They were going to deface Grandpa's house, mark him like a target. But before they could even pop the lids, floodlights snapped on. Agents swarmed, guns drawn. The men dropped everything, caught like rats in a cage. And that's when the real twist came. They weren't just random thugs. One of them was a city inspector. The same inspector who'd signed off on dozens of community improvement projects that never actually happened. The other, a contractor tied to Barbara's fake companies. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was cleanup. They'd been sent to send a message and maybe erase evidence. When the news broke, it rocked the city. Suddenly, the story of one stubborn old man's flag became something bigger. Headlines read, "Veteran Stand Exposes Web of Corruption." Cameras showed up on the street. Reporters wanted interviews. Neighbors who used to avoid the spotlight now stepped forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. And Grandpa. He just kept raising his flag every morning, same as always. But now, when he did it, the whole neighborhood watched, because it wasn't just a flagpole anymore. It was a line in the sand. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The arrests, the headlines, they were victories, sure. But the people at the top, the ones who'd been pulling strings this whole time, they were still out there, and if Barbara had taught me anything, it was that cornered animals fight the hardest. So as I watched Grandpa salute the flag one morning, the sun rising behind him, I swore to myself, whatever came next, whoever came next, we'd be ready. Because this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was mine to Dada's asterisk, the morning after the arrests. I woke to the sound of voices outside Grandpa's house. Not the low murmur of neighbors, but the sharp buzz of reporters. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw them news vans parked up and down the street. Cameras pointed at the flagpole. Microphones clutched like weapons ready to fire. And right in the middle of it all, Grandpa standing on his porch in his robe, coffee mug in hand. Looking about as comfortable as a cat in a bathtub, one reporter shouted, "Sir, how does it feel to be the man who took down a corrupt HOA?" Grandpa squinted into the sunlight and said, "I didn't take down anything. I just raised my flag." Then he turned and walked inside, leaving a crowd of confused journalists behind. That was Grandpa. He never saw himself as a hero. But the media didn't care. They spun the story into something bigger. Veteran defies HOA, exposes criminal network. Neighborhood hero sparks statewide investigation. One man, one flag, and a fight for freedom. It was everywhere. TV, newspapers, blogs, even national outlets picked it up. My phone buzzed nonstop with calls from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some wanted to congratulate. Some wanted interviews. Some wanted to help, though I could hear the greed in their voices. At first, the neighbors were thrilled. They finally had a spotlight to tell their side of the story. Families came forward with accounts of intimidation, bullying, even extortion. The narrative grew beyond our street. It became a movement. HOA horror stories poured in from across the country. People sent letters, emails, even videos saying, "We've been through the same thing. Thank you for standing up." But with attention came pressure. Reporters camped outside Grandpa's house day and night. Strangers drove by slow, snapping photos. Politicians showed up, shaking hands, talking about community reform while making sure the cameras caught their good side. Grandpa hated every second of it. One night, as the noise of generators from news vans hummed outside, he sat me down. His voice was calm but firm. "Son, I didn't fight for this country to see my front yard turned into a circus. All I wanted was to live in peace, raise my flag, drink my coffee. That's it." I nodded. "I know, Grandpa, but it's bigger than us now. People are looking to you." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "That's the problem. I'm not looking to be anyone's symbol. Symbols get used, and used people get broken." His words stuck with me, because while the world saw him as a hero, I saw the toll it was taking. His hands shook a little more each morning. His eyes looked a little more tired. He still stood tall. But the weight was showing. And then came the first crack. News anchor reported that sources close to the investigation suggested the corruption ring might reach into law enforcement itself. That some cops had looked the other way. Maybe even profited. The implication hit like a hammer. Because I was law enforcement. And suddenly, the cameras weren't just on Grandpa. They were on me. One outlet ran a headline. Did insider help uncover or cover up HOA crimes? Neighbors whispered. Some looked at me with suspicion. Strangers on the internet dissected my career, my record, my motives. The smear campaign had begun. I knew what it was. The people behind this weren't stupid. If they couldn't scare us, they'd discredit us. Drag us through the mud until the public stopped caring. Grandpa saw the news clip and turned off the TV with a snap. "Don't let it rattle you," he said. "A good man's name is worth more than their lies." But it did rattle me. Because once doubt is planted, it grows fast, and then came the second crack. One of the neighbors, a man who'd testified in court, who'd stood by us when things got ugly, suddenly reversed his story. On live TV, he claimed he'd been pressured into speaking out. That maybe things weren't as bad as they'd seemed. I knew it was a lie. I knew he'd been gotten too. But the damage was done. The headlines flipped. Key witness recants testimony. The momentum we'd built started slipping, and behind the media noise, the threats came back. Anonymous letters. Strange cars on the street. A drone buzzing over Grandpa's backyard one night. Vanishing before I could catch it. It felt like the whole thing was spiraling. One evening, I sat with Grandpa on the porch as the sun went down, reporters still lurking at the curb. I asked him if he ever regretted raising that flag, if he'd take it back just to have peace again. He looked at me, steady as stone, and said, "Peace bought with silence isn't peace. It's surrender. And I've surrendered enough in my life. Not here. Not now." That's when I knew they could twist the story. They could smear my name. They could try to turn neighbors against us, but as long as that flag flew, the truth stood taller than their lies. And the truth was still out there, waiting to come crashing down on them, because the deeper investigators dug, the more rot they uncovered. Names of officials. Bank accounts offshore. Contracts tied to companies halfway across the country. This wasn't just a neighborhood scandal anymore. It was the start of something national, and Grandpa, like it or not, was right in the middle of it. Asterisk, asterisk, the smear campaign wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was getting nastier. One station claimed I'd doctored evidence. Another said Grandpa had exaggerated the threats. Online, strangers hid behind fake names, calling us frauds, fakes, opportunists. I could take the heat. But Grandpa? He wasn't built for this world of half-truths and clickbait. Every time his name scrolled across the bottom of the TV, I saw his shoulders tighten, and then came the betrayal. It started small whispers. A neighbor who used to wave every morning stopped making eye contact. Another pulled their flag down one night, quietly, like they didn't want to be seen. But the real blow came when I checked my email one evening and found an anonymous tip. "Check your friend Sam. He's not who you think he is." At first, I laughed it off. Sam, our lawyer, Grandpa's old war buddy. No chance. He'd fought with us every step of the way. But doubt is poison. It seeps in slow. And when I looked closer, things didn't add up. Phone calls he claimed to make that I couldn't verify. Meetings he said he attended but never left notes for. Documents he'd filed late, with small errors that could have sunk our case if the judge hadn't overlooked them. And then I found it. A wire transfer. $10,000 sent to an account in his wife's name. The sender, a contractor tied to Barbara's network. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to think that the man Grandpa trusted with his life, the man who'd stood beside us in court, had been playing both sides, but the evidence was there. When I confronted him, it was late at night, outside his office. The parking lot was empty, the street lamps casting long shadows. "Why, Sam?" I asked, my voice low but burning. He didn't deny it, didn't even flinch. He just sighed, like a man carrying too much weight. "You don't understand," he said. "These people, they're not just HOA crooks. They're bigger, they reach farther than you know. I tried to fight them. I really did. But they made it clear, my family or yours. What would you have done?" I clenched my fists. "You sold us out. I bought you time," he shot back. "Those delays, those mistakes you think were accidents? They were shields. I stalled them long enough for you to win in court. Without me, you wouldn't have made it that far." I didn't know what to say. Was he lying? Was he telling the truth? Or was it both? Before I could push further, he handed me a folder. "This is everything I've got left," he said. "Names, dates, accounts. If they find out I gave it to you, I'm done. But maybe you'll finish what I couldn't." And then he walked away. I stood there in the dark, folder in hand, heart pounding. When I got home, I opened it. Inside were documents tying the corruption ring to developers, lobbyists, even a state senator. It was the kind of evidence investigators dream of, the kind that could topple careers, maybe even governments. But there was a catch. Grandpa came into the kitchen while I was reading, and I saw the look in his eyes. Tired, wary, but steady. "They'll come harder now," he said. "Desperate men do desperate things." He was right. The next week was chaos. The media turned the betrayal into a feeding frenzy. Hero's lawyer tied to corruption. Cameras shoved in our faces, asking if we'd known, if we'd been complicit, and then the threats came roaring back. Not letters this time, not shadows. Direct one morning. I found our mailbox stuffed with photographs, grainy shots of Grandpa at the grocery store, at church, even in his bedroom through the window, each one stamped with the same words, "We see you." That night, the front gate was spray-painted with a single word, ENOUGH. I called my contacts at the task force. They moved fast, stepping up protection, running down leads. But even they admitted this wasn't just about law anymore. It was about survival. The worst moment came 3 days later. I was driving back from town when I saw smoke in the distance. My chest seized. I floored it, heart slamming, praying it wasn't what I thought. But when I crested the hill, I saw flames licking up from Grandpa's garage. Neighbors were already out with hoses, trying to hold it back. By the time the fire department arrived, the garage was gone. Tools, photos, mementos, everything inside reduced to ash. Grandpa stood in the yard, face calm, but eyes blazing. "They think they broke me," he said. But all they did was remind me why we fight. The next morning, he raised the flag again. The pole was blackened at the base. The yard smelled like smoke. But that flag still caught the wind and flew. And the neighbors. One by one, they raised theirs too. A wall of red, white, and blue against the fear. The message was clear. We don't back down. But I knew we weren't just fighting for the neighborhood anymore. We were fighting against something bigger, darker, and more dangerous than anyone realized. And with Sam gone, with enemies closing in, the next move would have to be ours. Because if we waited for them to strike again, it might be the last ***. The fire in Grandpa's garage was supposed to break us. That much was clear. They wanted to send a message: give up or burn out. But they didn't know Grandpa. The morning after, he stood by the ashes, saluted the flag, and said, "A building can burn. A man's spirit can't." Still, I knew we couldn't just wait for the next attack. It was time to end this. The folder Sam had given me was the key. It listed names, bank accounts, offshore transfers, enough to put powerful people in handcuffs. But it wasn't complete. There were gaps, codes, references to meetings and locations that didn't make sense. Until one night, when I was going through it for the 100th time, I saw a pattern. The dates matched HOA board retreats. Fake retreats, trips Barbara and her allies took to cover their tracks. And the next one? It was scheduled for the very next weekend, a lakeside property, isolated, owned by a shell company that traced back to the senator Barbara had named. If we could get in, catch them in the act, it would be the nail in the coffin. But it was risky. Too risky for Grandpa. When I told him, I expected him to argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, pipe smoke curling around his head, and said, "If you're walking into a den of snakes, you don't go alone." I shook my head. "You're 80 years old, Grandpa." He smiled. "And I've been fighting snakes longer than you've been alive." In the end, there was no talking him out of it. So we went. The night of the retreat, the lake was black glass under the moonlight. We parked a mile out, hiked through the trees, every step crunching in the dead leaves. My heart hammered, but Grandpa moved steady, his old boots quiet as a whisper. When we reached the property, we saw them. Cars lined up, expensive ones. Voices drifting from the cabin. Laughter, glasses clinking. I slipped the recorder from my pocket, the one tied into the task force feed. This was it. We crept closer, peering through the window. Inside, men in suits sat around a long table, papers spread out, money being counted. Not HOA thugs anymore. These were the shot callers, and at the head of the table, the senator himself. My stomach nodded. This was bigger than I'd imagined. Grandpa put a hand on my shoulder. "Now you see why they're scared of a little flag," he whispered. We recorded everything. The money. The deals. The senator talking about keeping. Neighborhoods in line and expanding contracts. Proof that this wasn't just corruption, it was organized control, but then the floor creaked under. Grandpa's boot, the room went silent. Heads turned. "Who's out there?" Someone barked. I grabbed Grandpa's arm. "Run." We bolted into the trees as shouts rang out. Lights flashed. Footsteps thundered behind us. I pulled Grandpa down behind a fallen log just as a spotlight swept past. Men were crashing through the woods, calling out, closing in. Grandpa's breathing was heavy, but his eyes were calm. "You go," he said. "Take the recorder. And this." I shook my head. "Not without you." The footsteps grew louder, and then, just as a flashlight beam landed on us, red and blue lights exploded across the trees. Federal agents, drop your weapons. The task force had moved in. A dozen agents stormed the cabin, others flooding the woods. Shouts, curses, the sound of men hitting the ground. I helped Grandpa up, and we watched as one by one the suits were dragged out in handcuffs. The senator himself shoved into the back of a black SUV, face pale and furious. It was over. Not just Barbara, not just the HOA, the whole network. The next weeks were a blur, indictments, trials, headlines, splashed across every screen in the country. Senator tied to HOA scandal. Corruption ring dismantled. Barbara testified in exchange for leniency, her face gray and hollow. Sam disappeared into witness protection, his betrayal and redemption both buried under sealed records, and Grandpa. He became the symbol they never wanted him to be. Not because he asked for it, but because he'd earned it. One morning, a news crew caught him raising his flag, as always. They asked, "Why did you never stop?" He looked into the camera, weathered face steady, and said, "Because some things are worth standing for, no matter how many times they try to knock you down." That clip went viral. Millions watched it. And suddenly, across the country, flags started popping up in neighborhoods where us had tried to silence them. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about rules. It was about dignity. About the right to stand tall in your own yard and not be bullied by those who crave power. The neighborhood healed. The new HOA board became a model of transparency, working with residents instead of against them. The fear that had gripped the community for years was gone, replaced with something stronger: pride. But for me, the biggest moment came quietly. One evening, after the noise had died down, after the cameras had moved on, I sat with Grandpa on the porch. The sun dipped low, painting the sky orange and purple. The flag fluttered above us, catching the last light of the day. I turned to him and said, "We did it." He chuckled, low and tired. "No, son. You did it." I just kept doing what I always do. I shook my head. "No, Grandpa. You showed me how." He didn't answer. Just leaned back in his chair, eyes on the flag. A small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. And in that moment, I realized something. This fight had started with one stubborn old man refusing to take down his flag. But it had ended with a neighborhood, maybe even a country. Remembering that you don't have to bow to bullies, sometimes the loudest act of defiance is just standing your ground. And Grandpa, he stood taller than anyone I'd ever known. Asterisk, asterisk, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you in the next one. Peace out.